The bridge of the warship hummed with quiet efficiency as Commander Jake Morrison watched the stars drift past on the main screen, and his crew worked at their stations with practiced ease. And somewhere far across the galaxy a message was being sent that would change everything. But Jake didn't know that yet because he was focused on the routine patrol his ship was running along the outer edge of human territory, and the ship called Valiant was one of humanity's finest vessels, built with technology that made most alien races nervous because humans came from Earth, and Earth was what the galaxy called a death world. Most species evolved on calm, peaceful planets with gentle gravity and safe atmospheres, but humans came from a world that tried to kill them every single day, and they survived by becoming tough and stubborn and dangerous. And when humanity finally reached the stars 20 years ago, the other species didn't know what to make of them because humans were stronger and faster and more aggressive than anyone else, and they built their ships the same way with heavy armor and powerful weapons that could tear through anything. Jake was 42 years old with gray eyes and short dark hair, and he had been in the military since he was 18, and he had seen combat in 3 different wars, and he had learned that the universe was not a safe place, and that sometimes you had to fight to protect the people you cared about. And right now he cared about making sure his crew stayed safe during this boring patrol mission. Lieutenant Amy Crawford sat at the communications station and her fingers moved across the controls as she monitored the various channels that connected human space to the rest of the galaxy. And she was young, only 26, but she was good at her job, and Jake trusted her completely, and suddenly she stopped moving and her face went pale. Jake noticed immediately because a good commander always watched his crew, and he stood up from his chair and walked over to her station and asked what was wrong, and Amy looked up at him with wide eyes and said she was picking up a distress signal, and it was using Varelian encryption. The Varelians were friends of humanity, and they had been the first species to welcome humans into the galactic community, when everyone else wanted to quarantine Earth as too dangerous, and they were peaceful scholars who spent their time studying the universe and helping other species, and they never bothered anyone. And the idea that they were in trouble made Jake's stomach tighten. He told Amy to put the message through, and the main screen flickered and changed to show a Varelian woman, and her elegant features were twisted in terror, and blood was visible on her robes and behind her. Jake could hear screaming and the sounds of weapons fire, and the woman was gasping as she spoke. She said her name was Ambassador Lyra, and her ship was called Serenity Dawn, and they were under attack by unknown aggressors who had disabled their engines and were now boarding the ship, and they were killing everyone they found. And she begged anyone who received the message to please send help, and she started to give coordinates, but the transmission cut off in a burst of static. Jake stood frozen for exactly 3 seconds, and then his training took over, and he started giving orders in a calm, clear voice. And he told the navigation officer to plot a course to those coordinates at maximum speed, and the young lieutenant hesitated and pointed out that the coordinates were in neutral space near the Kryn expanse, and going in there could cause diplomatic problems. Jake looked at the lieutenant, and his voice was hard when he said that an ambassador was dying, and he didn't care about diplomatic problems. And he told the officer to plot the course now, and the lieutenant quickly obeyed, and within moments the Valiant's powerful engines roared to life, and the ship accelerated to speeds that would make most alien crews pass out from the force. Jake opened a channel to all the other human ships in the area, and he explained the situation and asked any vessel that could help to meet him at the coordinates, and he knew the message would reach other humans first because humanity used old-fashioned radio signals boosted to incredible power, while other species used slower quantum communication networks that had to route through bureaucratic channels. Amy reported that 3 other human ships were responding, and they were changing course to join the Valiant, and Jake nodded and felt some of the tension ease because backup was good, but he also knew they might be too late because the message had already been delayed and every second counted. The ship raced through space, and Jake pulled up information about the Kryn expanse on his personal screen, and what he read made him frown because the area was known for spatial anomalies that made it dangerous to navigate, and most species avoided it completely, but apparently someone was using it as a hunting ground to attack defenseless ships. The minutes crawled by, and Jake paced the bridge, and his crew worked in tense silence, and finally the navigation officer announced they were approaching the coordinates, and Jake ordered the ship to drop out of faster-than-light travel, and the stars snapped back into normal patterns on the screen. What Jake saw made his blood run cold because the Varelian diplomatic ship was floating dead in space, and its beautiful curved hull was scarred with weapons damage, and holes had been torn in the sides, and around it were 6 alien vessels that looked like nothing Jake had ever seen before because they were brutal and angular with sharp edges, and what looked like pieces of other ships welded to their hulls like trophies. Jake ordered his tactical officer to scan the unknown ships, and the young woman worked quickly, and then reported that the vessels matched the design of Vadrak raiders, and Jake felt his jaw tighten because he knew about the Vadrak from intelligence reports, and they were slavers and pirates who preyed on weak targets and sold their victims to the highest bidder. And the galaxy had been trying to stop them for years without success. The tactical officer's voice shook when she reported that only 18 life signs remained on the Varelian ship out of an original crew of 200, and Jake closed his eyes for just a moment and felt rage building in his chest because 200 people had been murdered while the galaxy did nothing. He opened a communication channel to the Vadrak ships and ordered them to stand down and release the survivors, but the aliens didn't respond with words, and instead they turned their ships to face the Valiant. And then a message came through, and the translation was rough but clear enough, and it said that the humans were soft and should run away or become products themselves. Jake smiled, but there was no warmth in his expression, and he told his communications officer to send a reply, and the message was simple and direct, and it said the Vadrak had made their last mistake. And then Jake turned to his tactical officer and ordered her to charge all weapons and raise shields to maximum and prepare to show these raiders what happened when they attacked friends of humanity. The Vadrak clearly thought the single human ship would be easy prey because they started moving forward in a standard attack formation, and they were probably planning to disable the Valiant and take the crew as slaves, but they had no idea what they were really facing because humanity didn't build ships for show, and they didn't train crews to surrender. Jake gave the order to fire, and the Valiant's railguns spoke first, and they accelerated tungsten slugs to incredible speeds, and the projectiles crossed the distance in seconds and slammed into the lead Vadrak ship, and the alien vessel's shields flickered and held for maybe half a second before collapsing. And then the slugs punched through the hull like it was made of paper, and the ship came apart in a massive explosion. The other Vadrak ships scattered in apparent shock because they had expected their prey to be helpless, but instead they were facing a predator. And Jake ordered his crew to target the ships closest to the damaged Varelian vessel because his priority was protecting any survivors, and missiles launched from the Valiant and streaked toward their targets, and 2 more raider ships exploded. The remaining 3 Vadrak vessels tried to run, but the Valiant was faster, and its weapons were more accurate. And Jake pursued them through space and ordered his crew to destroy every single one because these raiders had murdered innocent people, and they deserved no mercy, and within minutes all 6 alien ships were nothing but wreckage floating in the void. Jake ordered ceasefire and told his crew to prepare rescue teams and get over to the Varelian ship immediately and find any survivors and get them medical treatment. And as his people moved to obey, he stared at the debris field and felt a cold satisfaction because the Vadrak had thought they were hunters, but they had just learned that there was something more dangerous in the galaxy. They had triggered a distress signal and summoned the Deathworlders, and now the word would spread and other raiders would learn that attacking friends of humanity was a fatal mistake because humans protected their own, and they answered every call for help no matter the cost. Admiral Nicole Hayes stood in the war room deep inside Earth's orbital command station and looked at the holographic display that floated above the conference table, and her face was calm, but her mind was racing because the news from the Kryn expanse had just reached her, and it was both good and bad at the same time. The good news was that Commander Jake Morrison had rescued 18 Varelian survivors from the raiders and destroyed all 6 attacking ships with 0 human casualties. And the bad news was that this incident had exposed something much bigger and much worse than anyone had realized. Nicole was 56 years old, and she had spent her entire adult life in the military, and she had risen to become humanity's highest-ranking officer because she was brilliant at strategy, and she never backed down from a fight. And she understood that sometimes violence was the only answer to certain problems. Around the table sat the other senior commanders, and they were all watching the holographic replay of the Valiant's battle, and their faces showed a mixture of pride and concern, because yes, the human ship had won easily, but the Vadrak raiders were part of a much larger problem. Ambassador Peter Wright was also in the room, and he looked uncomfortable because he was a diplomat, not a soldier, and he preferred talking to fighting, but even he had to admit that talking hadn't stopped the Vadrak from murdering innocent people. Peter cleared his throat and explained that the Varelians had formally requested help from humanity, and Ambassador Lyra had survived the attack, and she had confirmed that at least 15 other Varelian ships had disappeared in the past 6 months, and everyone had assumed they were lost to accidents or spatial anomalies, but now the truth was clear. The Vadrak had been hunting them for sport and profit, and the Galactic Council had done nothing because most species in the galaxy found violence distasteful, and they preferred to form committees and write strongly worded letters instead of actually solving problems. One of the commanders at the table was Captain Victoria Price, and she was a tough woman from the Mars colonies who had no patience for bureaucratic nonsense. And she asked what the council was planning to do now, and Peter shifted uncomfortably and said they were considering economic sanctions. Victoria laughed, but there was no humor in it, and she said that economic sanctions wouldn't bring back the dead or free the slaves. And Peter nodded and admitted she was right, but explained that most species in the galaxy simply didn't think the way humans did about military force. Admiral Nicole cut through the discussion with a sharp gesture, and everyone fell silent because when the Admiral spoke, people listened, and she said that the Council's response didn't matter because humanity owed the Varelians a debt that couldn't be repaid with words. She explained that 20 years ago, when humanity first reached the stars, the other species had been terrified because Earth was classified as a Class 12 death world, and its people were stronger and tougher and more aggressive than anyone else, and most of the galaxy wanted to quarantine humanity and keep them isolated. But the Varelians had vouched for humans and argued that strength wasn't the same as evil, and they had helped humanity gain a seat at the galactic table, and without their support, Earth would still be alone and cut off from the rest of civilization. Nicole touched the holographic controls, and the display changed to show a star map, and dozens of red markers appeared in a region of space called the Kryn Expanse. And she explained that intelligence reports indicated the Vadrak had a major base hidden in the Crucis Nebula. The raiders had been operating for years and preying on scientific vessels and diplomatic ships and civilian transports, and they took prisoners as slaves and sold them to the highest bidder, and the galaxy had done nothing to stop them because most species didn't have the military capability or the will to fight. But humanity had both, and Nicole looked around the table and told the assembled commanders that she was authorizing a full military operation, and the mission would be called Task Force Retribution, and it would consist of 7 carrier groups and 43 warships and full marine support. Their objective was simple and clear, which was to eliminate the Vadrak presence in the Kryn Expanse and liberate any slaves being held and show the galaxy that humanity protected its friends. Captain Ryan Foster was the oldest commander at the table, and he was 61 with weathered hands and a face that had seen too many battles. And he pointed out that launching a major military operation in neutral space could have serious diplomatic consequences. Nicole nodded and acknowledged that he was right, but then she asked Ambassador Peter for his honest assessment of how the galaxy would respond, and Peter thought carefully before answering. He said that officially the Council would condemn any unilateral military action, but unofficially many species would be relieved to have the Vadrak threat eliminated, and the Varelians would support humanity publicly, while others would grumble but do nothing meaningful. Victoria said that, in other words, the galaxy would complain, while humanity did the dirty work that needed doing, and Peter admitted that was essentially correct, and Nicole smiled thinly and said that was fine, because humanity had never needed permission to do the right thing. She gave specific orders to each commander, and told Jake Morrison that the Valiant would lead the first wave of attack, and Captain Foster's Second Fleet would provide heavy support, and Captain Victoria's Third Fleet would handle pursuit and interception, because no Vadrak ship could be allowed to escape. Nicole emphasized that the galaxy was watching, and they had always seen humans as dangerous and aggressive, and this operation would confirm their fears, but it would also show that humanity protected its allies and answered calls for help. She said she would rather be feared and respected than liked and dismissed, and the other commanders nodded because they had all heard the whispers in council chambers about how humans were too violent and too unpredictable. The meeting ended and the commanders left to prepare their fleets, but Ambassador Peter stayed behind and asked Nicole what would happen if the situation escalated and if other raider groups saw this as a declaration of war. Nicole turned to face him, and her eyes were hard and determined, and she said that if other raiders wanted war, then they would learn the same lesson the Vadrak were about to learn, which was that Earth didn't back down and didn't negotiate with slavers, and didn't abandon. Friends, she gestured to the star map where markers representing human ships were beginning to move and converge on the Kryn expanse like a closing fist, and she explained that the Vadrak had made a critical error. They had attacked a Varelian diplomatic ship and triggered a distress signal, and they probably thought they were hunting easy prey. But what they had actually done was summon humanity's full military might, and now they would face the consequences. Over the next 2 days, the largest human fleet ever assembled began gathering at the staging point, and ships came from Earth and Mars and the outer colonies, and there were massive carriers that could launch hundreds of fighters and heavy cruisers, with weapons that could crack a small moon and dozens of support vessels. In the marine bays, soldiers checked their equipment and prepared for boarding operations, and in the fighter bays, pilots ran through final inspections, and in the command centers, tactical officers studied the terrain and planned for every possible scenario. The Valiant arrived first, and Jake Morrison watched as other ships appeared and took up positions in the formation, and he felt a grim satisfaction because the Vadrak had murdered innocent people, and now humanity was going to show them what justice looked like. Captain Ryan Foster commanded a huge carrier called the Vengeance, and it was armed with enough firepower to level a city, and his crew was experienced and deadly, and they were ready for whatever the raiders could throw at them. Captain Victoria Price led a group of fast attack ships that could chase down anything, and her people were mostly from the colonies where life was hard and people learned to fight young, and they were eager to prove themselves. As the fleet assembled, Nicole watched from her command station and felt the weight of responsibility because she was sending thousands of people into combat, and some of them might not come back, but this was necessary because the alternative was to let raiders continue preying on innocent victims. She opened a secure channel to all ships, and her voice was clear and strong when she told them that they were about to make history, and that the galaxy would remember this day, and that they should remember why they were fighting. They were fighting for the Varelians who had welcomed humanity to the stars, and for all the innocent people who had been taken as slaves, and for the principle that strength should be used to protect, not to exploit. Nicole told them to be professional and be deadly, and show the galaxy what humanity was capable of. And then she gave the order to jump, and one by one the ships activated their faster-than-light drives and disappeared into the void. The Deathworlders were coming, and the Vadrak were about to learn that triggering an SOS to humanity was the last mistake they would ever make. The Valiant dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the Kryn expanse, and Jake Morrison stood on the bridge watching the view screen fill with swirling clouds of purple and red gas that made up the Crucis Nebula, and somewhere inside that beautiful, deadly space, the Vadrak had built their fortress. Behind the Valiant came 5 other fast attack cruisers, and they took up formation in a tight defensive pattern, and they were the tip of the spear that would punch through the Vadrak defenses and draw out the enemy fleet so the main force could finish them. Lieutenant Amy Crawford reported that her sensors were already detecting interference from the nebula's radiation, and scanning would be difficult, but she was picking up multiple contacts ahead, and they appeared to be picket ships guarding the approaches. Jake ordered the fleet to move forward at combat speed and told his weapons officer to prepare to fire on any hostile targets, and the 6 human ships glided into the nebula like sharks entering hunting waters. The Vadrak picket line consisted of 6 frigate-sized vessels, and they spotted the humans immediately and moved to intercept, and Jake watched them come and felt no fear because he had already beaten these raiders once, and he would do it again. The Valiant's railguns fired first, and the tungsten rounds crossed the distance in heartbeats and smashed into 2 of the Vadrak ships, and the aliens tried to scatter, but it was too late, and their vessels exploded in brilliant fireballs. The surviving picket ships returned fire with energy weapons, but their shots splashed harmlessly against the Valiant's shields, because human defensive technology was far superior to anything the raiders possessed. Amy reported that the Vadrak were calling for reinforcements, and her sensors showed 30 more ships converging on their position, and Jake smiled coldly and said that was perfect because they wanted to draw out as many enemies as possible. The human cruisers tightened their formation and created overlapping fields of fire, and when the Vadrak reinforcements arrived, they charged in, expecting to overwhelm the smaller force through sheer numbers, but they had badly miscalculated. Humanity had learned to fight on Earth where predators hunted in packs and used teamwork to bring down larger prey, and they applied those same tactics in space. and the 6 cruisers moved together like a single organism. One ship would draw enemy fire while the others flanked and destroyed the distracted target, and they rotated positions constantly and supported each other, and the Vadrak, who were used to fighting disorganized civilian vessels, had no answer for this coordinated assault. Lieutenant Ben Hayes at navigation called out that a Vadrak cruiser was moving into position behind them for a torpedo shot, and Jake calmly ordered the ship to spin 180 degrees and return fire. The Valiant rotated with shocking speed for such a large vessel, and its ventral weapons batteries unleashed a devastating salvo, and the pursuing Vadrak ship was torn apart before it could launch its attack. All across the formation, the other human ships were performing with equal efficiency, and the Tempest cut through 3 raiders with precision laser fire, and the Havoc used its missiles to create kill zones that no enemy could survive, and the Falcon danced through incoming fire while its railguns picked off targets. Within 20 minutes, the Vadrak had lost 22 ships, and the survivors were breaking formation and retreating back toward their base, and Amy reported that the enemy was falling back, and Jake ordered all ships to pursue. He opened a channel to Admiral Nicole and reported that the door was open, and the Vadrak were exposed, and almost immediately space behind the human cruisers began to ripple and tear. Jump portals opened like massive wounds in reality, and through them came the full might of Task Force Retribution, and 43 warships emerged from faster-than-light travel in perfect formation. Admiral Nicole stood on the bridge of her flagship and watched as her fleet materialized in the nebula, and she felt satisfaction because the plan was working exactly as designed, and now it was time to finish this. Her tactical officer reported that the Vadrak base was ahead, and it was bigger than intelligence had estimated, and the raiders had hollowed out an entire asteroid and converted it into a fortress with heavy shields and at least 40 defensive platforms. Nicole studied the tactical display and saw that the base was formidable, but she hadn't brought this much firepower to be cautious, and she gave orders for all fighters to launch and for heavy cruisers to begin bombardment of the shield generators. The carriers disgorged hundreds of small, nimble fighters, and they screamed toward the asteroid base, and their weapons lit up the darkness, and the defensive platforms returned fire with energy beams and kinetic rounds. Human pilots were trained. In Earth's gravity and atmosphere, where flying was genuinely difficult and dangerous and space combat was almost easy by comparison, and they dodged incoming fire with contemptuous ease, and their missiles found targets with devastating accuracy. 3 defensive platforms exploded and 2 more were damaged, but the tactical officer reported that the fighters were taking casualties from some kind of flak field the Vadrak had deployed around the base. Nicole immediately ordered drone flights to suppress the flak emitters and told the fighters to pull back to safe distance, because she valued her people's lives and wouldn't waste them when alternatives existed. This was the fundamental difference between human tactics and the Vadrak's brutal methods, because humans planned for their people's safety and adapted to changing situations, while raiders just threw bodies at problems. Jake's voice came over the communications net and reported that his cruisers had broken through the defensive line, but that sensors were detecting something unexpected inside the asteroid, and there were thousands of life signs that weren't Vadrak. Nicole felt her stomach tighten because that meant the base was full of slaves, and a direct assault would kill the very people they had come to save. And she immediately ordered all ships to adjust their fire and target only defensive systems with precision strikes. She called for Major Carl Hughes, who commanded the 1st Marine Assault Battalion, and when his face appeared on her screen, she explained the situation and told him to prepare for a hostage rescue operation. Carl was a massive man with close-cropped hair and eyes that had seen too much combat, but he nodded calmly and said his Marines had trained for exactly this scenario, and if she could create a breach point, they would get the civilians out. The heavy cruisers focused their fire on specific points of the asteroid's shields and concentrated enough energy to create weak spots, and slowly, methodically, they burned through until the first section of shield collapsed. Nicole gave Carl permission to begin boarding operations, and dozens of assault shuttles launched from the carriers and raced toward the breach, and the human fleet provided covering fire that created a safe corridor through the defensive systems. The shuttles punched through the atmosphere retention field and into the hollow interior of the asteroid, and what the Marines found made them furious beyond words. The Vadrak had converted the entire interior into a slave market, and pens filled. with beings from dozens of species lined the walls, and the conditions were horrific, and the smell of suffering was overwhelming. Varelians and Kelthians and even some Zendari huddled in cages, and their faces showed the trauma of captivity, and many of them looked like they had given up hope of ever being rescued. Carl broadcast on the command net that they had confirmation of mass slavery operations, and estimated 3,000 prisoners and his Marines were beginning extraction procedures immediately. The Marines moved through the base with brutal efficiency, and Vadrak guards who resisted were shot without hesitation, and those who surrendered were restrained for later trial, but the priority was always the prisoners. Corporal Danny Shaw found Ambassador Lyra huddled in a corner, and her elegant features were covered in bruises and scars. But when she saw his uniform, her eyes filled with tears, and she whispered that she knew humans would come. Danny knelt beside her and gently helped her stand and told her that humanity always took care of its friends. And as they moved toward the evacuation point, more and more prisoners emerged from the shadows. All across the base, Marines were breaking open cages and guiding terrified civilians to the shuttles, and providing medical care and water and food, and telling them over and over that they were safe now. The last Vadrak resistance crumbled quickly because raiders who were brave when attacking unarmed civilians discovered they were cowards when facing soldiers from a death world who fought with discipline and purpose. Nicole received constant updates. As the operation progressed, and when Carl reported that all prisoners were accounted for and being transferred to medical ships, she felt relief flood through her. The tactical officer reported that most Vadrak defenders were dead, and they had captured about 200 prisoners, including several ship captains and the base commander. Nicole ordered that the prisoners be secured for trial because they would answer for their crimes under galactic law, and then she composed a message to the Galactic Council. She told them that the Vadrak presence in the Kryn expanse had been eliminated, and the slaves had been freed, and that Earth stood ready to respond to any similar threats in the future. She made sure the message made clear that humanity had answered the SOS and would answer others because the galaxy's predators needed to know that there was a bigger predator. The Galactic Council chambers on the neutral world of Concordia were filled with chaos as representatives from 47 different species argued and gestured and transmitted heated messages across the vast circular hall, and at the center of all this noise was a holographic display showing the destroyed Vadrak base. High Counselor Vex of the Zendari Compact tried to call for order, and his forearms moved in ritualized patterns. But hardly anyone was paying attention, because the human military action had divided the council into 3 groups. Some species celebrated the liberation of thousands of slaves and praised humanity's swift action, while others feared the military power that Earth had demonstrated and worried about future conflicts, and a third group was concerned about the precedent of unilateral military operations. Ambassador Peter Wright stood at Earth's podium and felt the weight of dozens of alien eyes watching him, and he had been called to explain humanity's actions, and he knew the next few hours would shape Earth's relationship with the galaxy for a very long time. Vex finally managed to get enough silence to speak, and he formally accused Earth of violating the Council's prohibition against military operations in neutral space, and asked how humanity responded to these charges. Peter took a deep breath and activated his display, and images appeared of the freed prisoners showing Varelians and Kelthians and others whose faces revealed the trauma they had endured, and he asked a simple question. He asked where the Council had been for the past 6 months while ships disappeared and people were murdered, and innocents were taken as slaves, and he pointed out that the Council had formed committees and discussed sanctions, but while they talked, people died. A Kelthian delegate rose, and her crystalline structure shimmered with agitation, and she said that the Council's methods took time, but preserved peace and order, while humanity had solved the problem with violence. Peter replied that yes, they had solved it, and that was what mattered. And 3,000 beings who would have died in captivity were now free, and 15 raider ships that would have continued attacking innocent vessels were destroyed, and a threat the Council couldn't address had been eliminated. A Thraxian representative demanded to know what cost this victory had come at, and said that humanity had shown the galaxy that might makes right, and that any species with sufficient military power could act without approval. Peter smiled without warmth and pointed out that every species in the chamber had that power, but they chose not to use it while Earth chose differently. because sometimes action was more important than consensus. Then Elder Corvin of the Varelian delegation stood slowly, and when his people spoke in council, everyone listened because they were respected for their wisdom and diplomatic skill. Corvin gestured to the images of freed prisoners and said that the Zendari spoke of precedent and the Kelthians spoke of peace, but he needed to speak of reality, and he explained that his niece Ambassador Lyra was in those images. He told the council that Lyra had described how the Vadrak boarded her ship and executed her crew one by one, and broadcast it to terrify the survivors, and they had laughed while murdering innocent people. The chamber fell completely silent as Corvin continued, and he said that the council had done nothing because it could not act swiftly enough, and by the time committees were formed, his niece would have been dead. But the humans had acted within hours and risked their lives for beings not of their species, and asked for nothing in return. And yes, perhaps the galaxy should fear humanity's power, but it should also consider this question. What if the next crisis threatened your people, and would you want careful deliberation, or would you want someone who answered the call immediately? And Corvin's words hit hard because every species could imagine their own people in danger. The chamber erupted again, but this time the tone was different, and several delegates nodded in agreement, and others looked thoughtful rather than angry, and the debate continued but with less hostility. High Counselor Vex announced that the council would take everything under advisement and adjourned the session until a consensus could be reached, and as delegates filed out, Peter was approached by Ambassador Trill of the Zendari. Trill was small and furry, and his species had been among the most vocal critics, but his expression seemed almost approving, and he told Peter quietly that many on the council were actually relieved. He explained that the Vadrak had been a problem for years, but no one wanted to be the first to take military action, and Peter asked why they were complaining if they were secretly grateful. Trill said it was politics because the council had to be seen maintaining order, even when that order was proving insufficient, and public statements didn't always match private feelings, and Peter understood but found it frustrating. Trill predicted that the galaxy would adjust now, and other raider groups would think twice before attacking council ships, and slavers would look over their shoulders, and the next time there was a crisis, more than a few species would quietly hope humans were nearby. Elder Corvin approached after Trill left, and the Varelian moved with grace despite his obvious age, and he thanked Peter on behalf of his people, and said they owed Earth a debt that could never be fully repaid. Peter replied that the Varelians owed nothing because they had vouched for humanity when Earth was new to the galactic community, and helped humans find their place among the stars, and this was just returning that favor. Corvin said that nevertheless the Varelian Assembly wished to propose a formal alliance with Earth, including mutual defense and cultural exchange, and shared technology because closer ties would benefit both species. Peter felt satisfaction because this was exactly what Admiral Nicole had hoped for, and he told Corvin that the United Earth government would be honored and promised to begin drafting preliminary documents immediately. Meanwhile, across the galaxy, the news of Task Force Retribution's success spread through both official channels and underground networks, and on frontier worlds colonists and settlers cheered, and in lawless systems, pirates and raiders grew nervous. On a mining colony called Epsilon Tertius, a Kelthian supervisor named Drex watched news feeds with his mixed-species crew, and when images of freed prisoners appeared, one of his workers began to weep. The worker was a young Varelian named Senna, and she explained that her sister had been on a research vessel that disappeared 4 months ago, and she had assumed her sister was dead. Drex pulled up the manifest of rescued prisoners and searched through the names and found one that made him smile, and he showed Senna the screen where it listed Dr. Mena of Varel Prime, who was an astrophysicist. Senna stared at her sister's name and then at the images of human Marines escorting freed prisoners to safety, and she said she should write a message to thank the humans. Drex agreed and said they all should, because stories like this were repeating across the galaxy, and families were reuniting with loved ones they thought were lost, and merchants felt safer traveling routes that had been dangerous. Even species, who had been suspicious of humanity's aggressive nature, began reconsidering their positions, and trade increased and diplomatic relations improved, and fear slowly turned to respect. But not everyone was pleased with the new situation, and in the dark reaches beyond council space, a group of raider lords gathered via secure quantum channels and they represented the largest pirate confederations and slaver rings in known space. They were furious because the humans had upset the balance they had carefully maintained and made an example of the Vadrak, and now their prey was growing bold and fighting back. One raider lord named Krax said that worse than that, the humans had shown the council that military action worked, and other species might follow their example and start defending themselves properly. A cold, calculating voice cut through the chatter, and it belonged to Supreme Commander Zeth, who led the Crimson Armada, which was the largest pirate fleet in existence, and he said they needed to send a message of their own. He proposed that if the humans thought they could police the galaxy, then the raiders would show them the cost of such arrogance, and they would strike at Earth's scattered colonies, which were lightly defended. Seth explained that humanity had committed their main fleet to task force retribution, and their home systems were more vulnerable than they had been in years, and they could strike hard and fast and leave before reinforcements arrived. The Mistress of Chains, who was a mysterious figure hidden behind encryption, said that raiding Earth's colonies was suicide, but Zeth disagreed and argued that they would show the humans that for every slave freed, they would take 10 more. One by one, the raider lords agreed to the plan, and they would contribute ships until they had 300 vessels, and they would hit 5 colonies simultaneously because humans couldn't defend everywhere at once. But they were making the same mistake as the Vadrak because they had no idea what they were really dealing with. And back on Earth, Admiral Nicole was receiving intelligence reports about unusual raider activity. Her sources in the criminal underground reported that pirate groups were pooling resources and moving ships toward human space, and something big was being planned. Nicole immediately ordered the home fleet to redeploy and cover the most vulnerable colonies, and she told her staff that if raiders hit somewhere they couldn't protect in time, then they would hunt down every single attacker afterward. She opened a secure channel to the mining colony of New Haven on Epsilon 7 was home to 3,000 settlers who lived in peace and worked together, harvesting rare minerals from the planet's crust, and they were a mix of humans and friendly alien species who had built a good life far from the Council's politics. Governor Marcus Kane was reviewing production reports in his office when the alarm started blaring, and he ran to the communications center where his security chief, Nina Torres, was staring at a tactical display with horror on her face. Nina reported that multiple unidentified ships were dropping out of jump space, and the count was already at 20 vessels, and all of them matched known pirate configurations, and Marcus felt his blood turn cold. He ordered shields raised and a distress call sent, and told everyone to get into the shelters immediately, and Nina confirmed she had already done all of that. But the nearest Earth military vessel was 6 hours away at best. Marcus watched the pirate fleet approach, and they weren't bothering with communication or demands because this was a raid designed purely to hurt and steal and kill, and he asked how long until the raiders were in weapons range. Nina said 10 minutes, and Marcus grabbed a rifle from the weapons locker and told her to alert the militia, because every colonist with military experience needed to be armed and ready because they would hold the line until help arrived. The colony's defensive platforms opened fire when the raiders entered range, but there were simply too many targets, and the pirates split into groups, with some engaging the platforms while others moved toward the colony to land ground troops. Nina reported that multiple dropships were heading for the main settlement and the mining facilities, and Marcus knew this meant close quarters fighting in the streets, and he rallied the militia at the colony's central square. The battle for New Haven was brutal and desperate, as colonial militia fought with the kind of determination that only comes from defending your home, and many of them were veterans of Earth's wars, and they knew how to fight. Buildings burned and people died, but the colonists held their ground and gave better than they got, because humans from a death world were tough even when outnumbered, and the pirates were shocked by the fierce resistance. In the command center, Nina maintained contact with the other colonies under simultaneous attack, and the story was the same everywhere, with raids by overwhelming force and colonists desperately holding on until help could arrive. She told Marcus that the distress calls had been received, and Admiral Nicole was deploying the home fleet, but the closest ships were still 4 hours out, and Marcus said they would buy those 4 hours with blood if necessary. Supreme Commander Zeth watched the raids from his flagship safely beyond the combat zones, and his 300 ships had struck 5 human colonies simultaneously, and everything was proceeding according to plan. He told his crew that the Crimson Armada would be remembered for showing the galaxy that humans could bleed, and their reach exceeded their grasp, and after this no one would dare challenge the raiders. His second-in-command Crix looked worried, and reported that they were taking heavier casualties than expected because the colonists were fighting like trained soldiers instead of panicking civilians. Zeth dismissed the concern and said that many colonists were veterans, which was why Earth seeded its colonies with military experience. But training only went so far against superior numbers, and he ordered the attacks pressed harder. What Zeth didn't know was that Admiral Nicole had anticipated exactly this scenario, and while the home fleet was hours away, she had positioned a rapid response group specifically for colony defense. Captain Ryan Foster stood on the bridge of his ship Defiant, and his aged hands were steady as he ordered maximum burn to New Haven, because his task group of 5 frigates was built for speed, and they were going to arrive much sooner than the raiders expected. His tactical officer reported that New Haven was still holding, but estimated they had less than 90 minutes before defensive collapse, and Foster said they would get there in 80 minutes and told his crew to charge all weapons. The Defiant and its sister ships tore through space at velocities that would kill most alien crews from the acceleration, but human crews were built different and trained different and could handle the punishment. When they dropped into normal space at New Haven, they didn't bother with warnings or hails because the pirates had attacked Earth's people, and now they would pay the price in blood. The frigates hit the pirate fleet like a hammer, and their upgraded weapons and shields were designed specifically for fighting multiple opponents, and they moved through the enemy formation with deadly grace. Foster ordered his ships to target the landing craft first because he didn't want any more pirates reaching the surface, and 3 dropships exploded before they could land. On the ground, Governor Marcus saw the sky light up with explosions and felt hope surge through him, and he shouted for all militia units to push back and make the raiders regret ever coming to New Haven. The colonial fighters surged forward with renewed energy, and pirates who had been advancing suddenly found themselves fighting opponents who knew help was coming, and the tide of battle shifted dramatically. Zeth watched his carefully planned operation fall apart and demanded to know where the human ships had come from, because intelligence said the nearest forces were hours away. Crix reported that the humans were faster than calculated, and that they were losing ships rapidly, and recommended immediate withdrawal. But Zeth refused because retreating would make them look weak. He ordered all ships to engage the frigates and overwhelm them with numbers, but the pirates had been fighting soft targets for so long they had forgotten how to fight real warships. The human frigates danced through their formations, and their point defense systems swatted away incoming fire, while their main guns cut through pirate vessels like paper, and within 30 minutes half the raider fleet was destroyed or fleeing. Crix insisted they had to go or lose everything, and Zeth finally accepted reality and ordered all ships to scatter and retreat and regroup at the fallback point. But Admiral Nicole had anticipated this too, and as the pirates broke formation and ran, they found their escape routes blocked because the home fleet had arrived, and it was 3 times larger than Foster's task group. Heavy cruisers and carriers emerged from jump space in a perfectly coordinated net that cut off every exit, and Nicole's voice broadcast across all channels, ordering the pirate vessels to power down and prepare to be boarded. Some pirates surrendered immediately, while others tried to fight and were destroyed, and a few, including Zeth's flagship, managed to activate jump drives and escape, but they left behind 250 ships and thousands of raiders. On New Haven, Governor Marcus walked through his battered colony as medics treated wounded and engineers assessed damage, and 47 colonists were dead with hundreds more injured, but they had held the line. Captain Foster's shuttle landed, and the veteran officer emerged to applause from the colonists, and Marcus shook his hand and thanked him, because without his intervention everyone would have been dead or enslaved. Foster said that Marcus and his people had fought like hell and held on until help arrived, and that took real courage, and Marcus replied simply that they were from Earth, and fighting was what humans did. Over the next week, the galaxy watched as Earth dealt with the captured raiders, and those found guilty of murder or slavery were executed, while others received long prison sentences. Admiral Nicole sent a message to every criminal organization in known space, making it clear that attacking Earth's people meant annihilation, and the galactic underworld received that message loud and clear. Raids on human colonies dropped to near zero overnight, and pirate lords who once operated with impunity began looking over their shoulders, knowing that the Deathworlders were watching. In the council chambers, the debates about humanity's military actions took on a different tone, and species who had criticized Task Force Retribution were forced to admit that Earth's aggressive response had made the galaxy safer. Ambassador Peter stood before the Council, and High Counselor Vex formally acknowledged Earth's actions in eliminating the Vadrak threat and defending against the Raider attacks. Peter accepted graciously and explained that humanity hadn't acted to gain power or influence, but because people needed help and friends were in danger, and the right thing to do was obvious. He said that Earth would continue responding to threats against their people and allies, but they weren't seeking to become the galaxy's police force. Peter made clear that if someone triggered an SOS or sent a distress call, or if innocent lives were at stake, then the Deathworlders would answer every single time. A Thraxian delegate asked what would happen if species began relying too heavily on human military might, and Peter smiled and said they would teach others to defend themselves. He explained that humanity was happy to share defensive technologies and training methods and tactical doctrine because they wanted a galaxy where everyone could protect themselves and their loved ones. Elder Corvin announced that the Varelian Assembly had proposed a new initiative called the Mutual Defense Compact, which would be an alliance of species committed to rapid response against piracy and slavery. Peter said Earth would be honored to be a founding member, but emphasized that the compact must have teeth and no more committees that took months to act while people died. Several delegates